You might be aware that, and I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, if not all of you, saw The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson movie. That's been a long time, isn't it? I mean, that's been a while ago, wasn't it? Well, I guess he's making the sequel, if you will, to that. And it will be interesting because if you remember, the story kind of ends in this, Passion of the Christ ends in kind of a nebulous way, right, with Jesus in the tomb. It's not exactly, and it just ends, if you remember. It'll be interesting to see how he develops the story, how he presents the resurrection. Indeed, if he does, right? Because as we know, and this gospel reading is actually a little bit of the end of the reading we heard at the Easter Vigil, right? And it's the continuation on of kind of tidying up the details of that story, right? But as we know, there was nobody witnessed the resurrection itself. No one witnessed it. And in fact, Matthew's gospel has a really interesting way of presenting the story, right? That it's the guards are there and they're guarding, the tomb, right? And there's this earthquake and they're all afraid, right? And then this angel appears, right? Now this is the critical point, right? The angel rolls the stone away. Now you'll notice that he never says, "Here's Jesus." Right? There's an obscure cultural reference. The younger people won't get it. Right? And why? Because he's not there. When the stone is rolled away, the tomb is empty. That's important. That's an important detail. There are no accounts in any of the four Gospels of the resurrection. All we have is the empty tomb. And then later, and in this case, very shortly later, the appearance of the risen, glorified Christ, who has changed. And if you remember from the account in John's Gospel, and we'll hear that coming up, I think, somewhere, Mary Magdalene encounters the risen Christ and does not recognize him, right? So in his glorified state, he has been totally transformed. There is no witness to the resurrection. Now, oftentimes we say to ourselves, at least I have, and maybe you have too, boy, it sure would have been great to be Mary Magdalene or one of these apostles, right? Especially like Thomas. That you would have this encounter with the risen, glorified Christ. You could have sat with him, talked with him, ate with him. That's an important detail, right? Ghosts don't eat, right? Ghosts don't eat. Where would it go, right? He's a real human person, but he's also totally transcendent from our experience of what that means. So we think to ourselves, boy, it would have been great to have that experience. But again, think of Thomas. He doesn't, he's got questions, right? Now, eventually he does experience the risen Christ, and he comes to faith, God bless him, right? But even despite that, he's still known as Doubting Thomas, poor guy, right? That's what we remember him for, even though he was a great apostle and took the faith to India. Right? What a great, which is true, which is an historical fact, as it turns out. And that's an aside. Right? But ultimately, our faith rests on the empty tomb. Right? That's what we've got. And it is faith. That's important, isn't it? It's not historical knowledge, right? In the sense of, we know that the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, and in 1492, Columbus, forgive me for saying Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? These are historical facts. But our faith in the resurrection, which we have celebrated, and the entirety of the Paschal mysteries that were set before us once again last week and yesterday, right, rest on faith. And faith is a gift. And if God had not given you that gift, you wouldn't be here today. God has given us this gift, right, built on faith and the witness of these people who left this tradition for us. You know, and that first reading from the Acts of the Apostles is wonderful. It's Peter, and he's giving basically the first homily. Right? It's like the first homily. It's on the day of Pentecost. It's only chapter 2. It just started, right? And they've all received, the apostles have received the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and now Peter is proclaiming the same truth that we build our faith on. The word of this man and his friends, that this Jesus of Nazareth lived a great life, worked all these signs as we heard, right, was unjustly taken into custody and hung on a tree and died, but rose again. And that crowd then comes to faith. And that's a profound thing to think about, isn't it? You know? I mean, when you think about your biological human life, right? Think about that. Going back to day dot, you are the product of people who lived at least long enough to reproduce. Now today, we take that for granted, right? Almost, right? But 100 years ago wasn't like that, right? Children, well, you know, child mortality was incredibly high. But all of us are, this is an aside too, really. But anyway, all of us are the product of survivors. And indeed, we are the product of people handing down the faith, one person to another, one real person to another, right? If at any point people stopped believing, that would have died out. It would have died, but it didn't. Right? Why? Because it's the gift of faith that God has given us. Remember the words of that great man of the Sanhedrin, the great elder of the people of Israel, Gamaliel. We'll hear his story later on in Easter, right? Who says, don't mess with these guys, the apostles, right? Because if it's not from God, it'll die out on its own. And think about that. Think about well, again, you gotta have some age on you for this, right? But think about all the crazy religious movements that have been spawned, these cult things that kind of rose up, and a bunch of people, like the Jim Jones guy, remember that, right? Thousands of people from the Bay Area followed this guy to Guyana, right? And they all drank the Kool-Aid and killed themselves, and that was the end of that, right? That religion is not as popular as it used to be, right? And that's just one example. Remember the Hale-Bopp comet people? I was a theology student then, right? There was the people that thought, there was this, Messiah coming behind this comet, which you could see. You could see it out that way in the evenings, right? Died out, right? If it's not of God, it'll die out on its own. But if it's from God, you will not be able to kill it. And isn't that true? Right? For 2,000 years, from human being to human being, this faith has been handed down to us. And for that reason, right, we are dependent upon them. We need to honor them, to respect the faith that they handed down. That's another important thing to think about, I think, right? We're tempted to think we're much more advanced than those people. They were ignorant. Peter and all those guys, they were ignorant. We got it all figured out now. No. The faith is the faith. Right? It's a gift that we've received. It's not for us to monkey with. But what a powerful gift it is. Because if we truly believe, one day our tomb, whatever that might be, will be empty.